It is the 12th of October 1971. Iran's long-time reigning monarch Mohammad Reza Pahlavi opens the festivities for the 2500-year celebration of the Persian Empire. This could be seen as the Shah being at the height of his power, and why wouldn't it seem so? Most of his opponents seem to have been sidelined, and on the international stage, Iran was destined to replace the United Kingdom as the dominant power in the Persian/Arabian Gulf. 8 years later, though, this would seem like a distant dream. No longer the Emperor of Iran, Muhammad Reza was now a dying man who was forced to go into exile. So this begs the question, why was the Shah overthrown? In 1963, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi launched the White Revolution, a program which intended to rapidly modernize Iran through a series of socio-economic reforms. These reforms intended to redistribute land while aiming to industrialize Iran. They also intended to eradicate illiteracy and to improve access to healthcare while empowering women. These reforms led to the socio-economic advancement of Iran, with the World Bank's data indicating that during the first decade of the White Revolution, Iran's annual growth rate was consistently above 7%. The country's GDP per capita also rose from $197 to around $876. The reforms also created a modern middle class in Iran. However, this didn't mean the country's economy didn't face any issues. Although Iran saw a rise in its oil income after the 1973 oil crisis, it also led to an increase in inflation. According to the data from the World Bank, the country's inflation rate rose from 2% in 1970 to 27% in 1977 due to a rise in the cost of living, corruption, and nepotism. The middle class started to feel disgruntled with the Pahlavi state. These three factors were essential for the start of the 1979 revolution. Another factor which led to the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty was the attempt to westernize Iran. The Shah was perceived to be an American puppet by many. He was also said to be a Francophile, with his outsourcing of the preparations for the 2500-year celebration of the Persian Empire to French companies being an example. His pro-Western attitude then led to what was considered to be the Westernization of Iran. The previously mentioned White Revolution gave women the right to vote and improved their legal and economic position. The secular nature of the monarchy was seen by many religious and conservative Iranians as an attack on the Iranian identity. This secular and westernized outlook of the Pahlavi dynasty was highlighted by a series of letters from Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, which requested the latter to modernize Saudi Arabia by permitting women to wear miniskirts and permitting the establishment of discos in the country. King Faisal, in response, wrote a letter to the Shah, reminding him of the fact that the religion of most Iranians was Islam. This response to the Shah's letter highlights the fact that the rapid westernization of the country wasn't really palatable to most of Iran's population, who remained tied to their religion and traditions. The Shah was also personally quite unpopular among many Iranians. As mentioned before, the Shah of Iran was considered to have been leading a secular lifestyle, which was disliked by many clerics and religious Iranians. The Shah was also criticized by many for being extravagant and decadent. This decadence could be highlighted by the 2500-year celebration of the Persian Empire, which was a lavish event that was estimated to have cost Iran millions of dollars. Furthermore, the Shah was said to have been worth at least $1 billion, while most Iranians were beset by high inflation. This built a perception of the Shah being a ruler who lived in luxury, while the masses suffered. Among the socio-economic groups alienated by the Shah were the Bazaris, a class made up of the merchants of the bazaar, a traditional Iranian marketplace. The Bazaris felt the Pahlavi dynasty had sidelined them in their pursuit of building a modern economy. In addition to their religious concerns, the merchants were dissatisfied with the mandatory dues that they were required to pay to the state-aligned Rastakhiz party. Furthermore, the Bazaris found themselves to be the target of an anti-profiteering campaign launched by the Rastakhiz party, which placed price controls on goods, and failure to comply with the rules could have led to arrest. This was the breaking point for most of the merchants, who then emerged as one of the strongest supporters of the Iranian Revolution. Speaking of the Rastakhiz party, another factor which led to the fall of the Shah was the authoritarian nature of the government. Democracy, according to the Shah, was a luxury that Iran couldn't afford. Therefore, he established a political structure that was centered around him. In 1975, the Shah established a one-party system under the Rastakhiz party, which was seen by many as an attempt to suppress dissenting voices. The Rastakhiz party also earned the ire of apolitical Iranians, such as the aforementioned Bazaris. To further secure his power in Iran, the Shah also used the Savak, or the secret police. The organization became infamous among Iranians as it quickly built a reputation of ruthless brutality. The perception of the Shah being a repressive and ruthless dictator who suppressed dissent also became a catalyst for the revolution. In defiance of the Shah's government rose an ideologically diverse group of movements. However, most of the opposition could have broadly been divided into three main factions: the left-leaning communists, the liberal constitutionalists, and the religious Islamists. The communists were made up of parties and armed guerrilla organizations like the Tudeh party and the Fedaini Khalq. There was also another organization called the Mujahideen Khalq, which was ideologically guided by a synthesis of revolutionary Marxism and Shia Islam. Due to Iran sharing a long border with the Communist Soviet Union, the Savak and the authorities mainly focused on suppressing the communist-aligned movements. The liberal constitutionalists desired to establish a constitutional monarchy, as called for in the 1906 Constitution. However, they couldn't attract much of a following, and they played an insignificant role in the revolution. Then there were the Islamists and the Shia ulema, or clergy. Throughout Iran's modern history, the ulema had played a role in the country's political affairs. They were the force behind the 1891 tobacco protest and lended their support to the 1906 constitutional revolution. They also organized demonstrations which played a role in bringing down the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. Under the Pahlavi dynasty, the role of the ulama in Iranian politics was reduced as Iran moved towards a secular state. This led to many in the ulama opposing the Pahlavi dynasty's rule over Iran. Among those clerics was a man called Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah Musavi Khomeini, who from the religious center of Qom and then from exile in Iraq and France, criticized the Shah and his rule over Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini sought to replace the Pahlavi dynasty with a form of theocracy called the Velayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. He addressed the economic and religious concerns of Iranians, which led to a surge in his popularity. He also aligned with other factions to form a united front against the Shah, despite the ideological differences between them. This then paved the path for the overthrow of the Shah and the rise of Khomeini after the 1979 revolution. In January 1978, an article critical of Ayatollah Khomeini was published in a major Iranian newspaper called Etalat. In response, demonstrations broke out in Qom, which were crushed by force. 40 days later, demonstrations broke out in other cities, which were also crushed by force. Protests against the Shah continued during spring and summer of 1978. Although the Shah attempted to negotiate by reforming the Savak and liberalizing the political system, the protesters refused to negotiate after the army massacred demonstrators in an event called Black Friday. After the massacre, nationwide strikes and riots broke out, leading to the formation of a military government. Protests peaked in December, when millions joined in support of the demonstrations. The Shah seemed to have lost control, and then on the 16th of January 1979, he fled Iran for Egypt. Khomeini then returned the following month, and then became the leader of a new Iran. While the previously mentioned factors were instrumental to the success of the revolution, it would be a mistake not to consider the effect the Shah's health had on his decision making during the revolution. The Shah was generally considered to be indecisive during crises, and on top of that was diagnosed with cancer. This made it difficult for the government, which was politically centered around the Shah, to effectively respond to the protests. Reliant on medication which eased his pain, Mohammad Reza was a man waiting for his imminent death. Now, in my humble opinion, which could be considered a conjecture, the Shah was much more willing to give up power in 1979 as compared to before, because he viewed preserving his power through violence to be futile, as he was living on borrowed time. The 1979 revolution was a watershed moment in Iran's history. Those 13 months of protests brought an end to the monarchical tradition that had lasted for more than 2 millennia, replacing it with an Islamic Republic based on the principles of the Velayat-e-Faqih. Out of all the factors discussed in this video, I would argue that the economic issues that the Iranian population faced during the mid to late 1970s were the most influential for the start of the revolution. This is because the rise in inflation directly affected most Iranian lives and led to further inequality in the country. Although many Iranians were unhappy with the secular nature or the extravagance of the monarchy, it wasn't that serious of a concern as long as they were reaping some of the benefits of, of Iran's economic success. However, with the economic failure of the late 1970s, many Iranians began to look towards the ulema and or the communists in the hope of a better future.